Phone check. 1, 2. The microphone check. 1, 2, 1, 2. The microphone check. I got my headphones tuned between two different AM stations, and my briefcase is full of declassified information. Declassified. Declassified.
Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 49th week of 2014. For more than 20 years, our program has been a spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion on the news of the week and its coverage by the media. First on a so-called community radio station, and when censored and locked out of there, welcomed, I'm happy to say, by the good people at Urbana Public Television. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight are David Green and Ron Zote. Our program's name, News from Neptune, was chosen to honor Noam Chomsky, who's been talking sense about American politics for twice the quarter century we've been on the air. Chomsky has said that in the American media, quote, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true and will sound like it's from Neptune. Our format is to take turns suggesting stories from the week's news that have been ignored or misreported, occasionally even innocently. Previous programs are archived on YouTube and posted to the Facebook page for News from Neptune, where you'll also find comments from viewers, not all unadulterated praise, and some answers from us. I also can be reached at carl@newsfromneptune.com, and I'm happy to receive your comments. It's December 5th. Long ago, as President Richard Nixon was being driven from office for a third-rate burglary, as his staff accurately called it, a minimal crime, in fact, in comparison with those committed by the present White House incumbent, or even others committed by Nixon himself. His Attorney General of unhappy memory, John Mitchell, was driven under a profound truth about the American presidency. Quote, watch what we do, not what we say, close quote. So, our own occupant of the White House, what has he done this week? First, he's continued to risk war in Europe in order to attack the Russian and Eurasian economy for the benefit of the American 1%. And he's had the hysterical help of the American media on this issue. It's really quite shocking. Secondly, he's expanded the war in the Mideast by attacking Iraq and Syria while sending more U.S. combat troops to Afghanistan. Afghanistan, you remember the war he was winding down and getting all the troops out of? He wasn't. 3, he's appointed a Bomb Iran man as the new Secretary of Defense. And 4, he's appointed a known abusive police chief to the head of his Police Reform Commission in response to the recent police killings across the country. This crisis, in fact, has been brought on by the policing tactics encouraged by his administration, and they've been used against Occupy Wall Street protesters and communities of color across the country that have suffered most from those policies. What, in fact, we're seeing is a protest of the president's war and austerity policies and the police repression as a general condition of an attempt to suppress those protests. So you're watching News from Neptune, a watch what we do, not what we say edition, and we'll start with Ron Zote.
Well, I have several points I want to mention today and ask your opinion about. The big one in the news, of course, has been the situation of the police abuse, as I see it, of some minority people, and I think we'll return to that. There are a number of other issues that we might talk about, and I don't know if we're ever going to get to them. The conflict over school books in Colorado and Texas, where there's a extreme right-wing school board for the state that has chosen a series of history textbooks that claim, among other things, implicitly or explicitly, that Moses was a forebear of the American Constitution. He was, in fact, one of the founding fathers, and so on. So if that strikes you as somewhat reasonable, I guess I don't know what to say, but anyway, there are a series of things like that. The latest one apparently being that some member of the Texas State School Board has posted something online about, in effect, endorsing the Ku Klux Klan, and it was quickly taken down after some people mentioned or found out about what was going on. But it's kind of strange, the things that can happen when you have right-wing school boards choosing textbooks for use in the schools. And this is, of course, a perennial battle about what the school books will contain. Can they mention evolution, for example, or must they always mention creationism as an alternative view of how biological evolution came about, and so on? The battle there continues endlessly, as far as I know. So, and there's one guy in particular who keeps writing to the newspaper. His letters appear at least once a month now, denouncing the idea of evolution, claiming that there's absolutely nothing to it. There's no experimental support for it, and just completely denouncing the whole thing as a terrible mistake. It's a lie. It's horrible, and this keeps happening again and again. Have you noticed this guy? It keeps.
I recall a letter recently
Yeah.
about a guy who challenged us to decide whether we are all here because of a rock, you know, something to do with a meteor or the Earth being made out of a rock going through space, or a bunch of rocks colliding with each other,
Right.
as opposed to God.
Yeah.
And I don't know, it's kind of a false choice on either side, if you ask me.
Yeah.
Maybe he's an example of the very argument he wants to make. No such thing as evolution, only devolution, and he's the result of the process.
Yeah. Well, there are some related things that we need not get into. Recent story in the New York Times says everything happened for a reason, and there's a deep question there about that.
I believe
we
that.
have
I believe that.
of
I
course.
believe that.
Yeah, most people do.
Yeah.
And for example, Einstein did. That's why he rejected quantum theory for most of his life, because at base, quantum theory says there are some things that happen completely randomly, and that's deeply repugnant to the human mind. When we have to find some kind of pattern or meaning or some reason why things happen, and for Bohr and the Copenhagen people to say, nope, there's no deeper reason behind it, just seems the abandonment of the principle of sufficient reason, as it's called, has all kinds of extremely unpleasant consequences for our mental life.
Well,
And,
I'm certainly not going to sit here and argue quantum theory with Einstein.
well, he did argue it with Niels Bohr, and it was a big issue, and it still is to some extent, because at base, quantum theory says that things happen completely randomly, some things, and for no reason at all. And again, that is deeply repugnant to the human mind. But then there are others who claim that there are no coincidences. For example, those who are influenced by the psychoanalytical Carl Gustav Jung, J-U-N-G, and so on. And well, I think that there are certain things that, great many things that are actually just coincidences. But again, a lot of people resist that. And there's an element of magical thinking in the minds of a whole lot of people. Here's an article in the New York Times, October 27th, magic may lurk inside us all. And there are some who are saying this. We're more susceptible to magical thinking than we'd like to admit. In a clever demonstration of magical thinking, an experimenter hands you several darts and instructs you to throw them at different pictures. Some depict likable objects, for example, a baby. Others are neutral, for example, a face-shaped circle. Would your performance differ if you lobbed darts at a baby? It would, and this has been shown experimentally again and again. So the anthropological definition of magic apparently is a belief in a kind of esoteric technology that you will accomplish certain things by carrying out certain acts and rituals or saying certain words and so on, and when there's really no empirical or experimental basis for any such things. But I'm getting way off on a tangent
It's
here.
the science fiction writer Theodore Sturgeon who said many years ago that given a sufficiently advanced technology, there's no difference between that and magic.
Exactly, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you brought in some people from, well, we're not allowed to say primitive anymore, but
Primeval.
right, a pre-literate group put a radio on the table and a human voice started coming out of it, they would think it's magic, right? And there are still some people who claim that, look, when you flip a light switch, can you really explain that? I mean, isn't that de facto magic? And so on.
But not being able to explain something and thinking that it's magic are two different things.
Right. Yeah.
There's 99.99% of what goes on can't be explained at this level, whatever level of human consciousness we're operating at now.
Yeah.
Whether in this room or in the whole world.
And it's important to realize that what we give as reasons for things happening are almost always things that we don't know from any direct experience, but we know because someone we trust has told us that.
Yeah.
So, you know,
Well,
what we're dealing with is a social phenomenon, a social construction of the world in a certain sense of the word, that means that we, should keep talking.
But the experimental psychologists are trying to get us beyond that, and it's difficult to do at times because we're all very much wedded from a very early age. The Yale psychologist has discovered that people make the mind-body distinction very early on in babyhood, and we're all captive of this ghost in the machine kind of view of things and why people do things and so on.
But in an important argument, owing to our own intellectual mentor here, Noam Chomsky, the mind-body problem is in fact incoherent and can't even be stated. So we're talking about psychological perceptions, not philosophical conclusions.
Right. So again, this is getting way off the track. What I wanted to talk about, back to the police abuse of minorities, and why does this keep happening over and over again? I've raised this point earlier in here. Why is it that local police departments or cities, jurisdictions, are unable or unwilling to control the police and to expel people who abuse minorities, such as killing black males and so on? And it's because I think we have this kind of troubled double consciousness about what the police are doing. We want them to obey the law and be decent, respectable, and so on, and how they treat people. At the same time, we want them to keep the lower orders down.
Exactly.
And they, in their unions and so on, other spokesmen at times will say, look, we can't do both. And if you want us to, in effect, keep the niggers down, you have to let us do whatever we think is effective in order to do that. And so decide, what do you really want? And
I think
it's a problem.
I think we can look at this in a number of contexts historically. Obviously, the whole racial context historically, but we can also begin to look at it in the context of the drug war since the 1970s, which was actually started by the aforementioned Richard Nixon, and the manner in which
for social control purposes of social control.
Yeah, in the post rebellion era of the early 1970s. We can look at the same time with the advent of this broken windows theory of policing, which posits that any sign of disorder must be quickly quashed, otherwise it will spread out. It will emerge in more from a broken window to well beyond that. I think we could look beginning at, with the Reagan era in the 1980s, we can certainly begin, and then with Clinton's passing the crime bill in 1996, we can look at the advent of policing as we understand it now, and in the post 9/11 era, we can begin to see the fact that the war on terror was combined with policing to bring things in this sort of neoliberal context, in this context of increasing gentrification of of inner cities, of urban areas, of certain urban areas, and marginalizing of dispossessed people or poor people in urban areas, that all of these factors historically merged. The militarism brought, I mean, it didn't have to be projected in Afghanistan and Iraq to be brought home here, but they work kind of synergistically with each other to the point where you have cops growing up in this environment who've probably been watching programs like Cops since they were kids on Fox and whatever other media it is that encourage this sort of besieged and aggressive mentality. I mean, this America's Most Wanted program and so forth. All of these things that have stoked fear over all these years, to the point where a cop, apparently it's fairly common for cops to feel that if they see a minority, a black youth, who's any threat at all they have to do is say that kid has been reaching to his waistband, and he can be killed.
Yeah, I thought I saw him going for a gun, so
Yeah.
I shot him. And there's a lot of that going on. And hey, I have a right to defend myself, right? They're all defending themselves. I thought I was unsafe and threatened. I feared for my life, and this has become completely routine
But
now.
we have to keep bringing it up to the system level. I mean, it's not the cop. It's not any cop per se. It's not Darren Wilson per se. I don't know what would have been accomplished by indicting him, except to send a message that they need structural reform. Maybe, I mean, I'm not saying he shouldn't have been indicted. He deserved to be indicted. Every one of these cops who's murdering young black men deserve to be indicted. But that will only be helpful if that generates systemic and structural change in the way policing is done in this country, and ultimately will only be helpful if it generates change in the way the economy works vis-a-vis poor people, minority people, and black people in this country.
Yeah, I like to take a more interactive point of view. Is there another half of this which is more subjective and psychological about the kind of people that police work attracts? Is there an authoritarian personality, for example?
It doesn't appeal to me I mean, it certainly, I mean, you could look at what cops are like and who are attracted, and you could probably make arguments about what there is. But even in a case like Darren Wilson, you got a young kid, really. I mean, not exactly a hardcore John Burge, the guy in Chicago who was finally, after many years of abusing people, was finally, kicked out and tried. That's rare. I just think it's. I mean, I don't know what to say other than it's not. I mean, there's plenty of kids that come from the background Darren Wilson came from, and don't want to be cops. Yeah. They're socialized into a certain culture, right, and they're exposed to media, and they're exposed to stories. They're exposed to the thin blue line and the code of silence and all the stuff that we hear about. But clearly, Darren Wilson, I believe him when he says he was afraid of Michael Brown. Maybe I'm wrong.
Well, it's perfectly possible.
But I believe him.
I don't necessarily believe it or disbelieve it.
I think he's
reasonable.
He's come from a culture generally and specifically in which he's learned to be afraid of people like Michael Brown.
Yeah.
And see them as a threat to his life.
Black guys are immediately viewed as a threat.
Yeah.
And there's a kind of implicit profiling that goes on, however much you may
Yeah.
be against that,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
fear of
Yeah.
black people.
Yeah.
And they sometimes promote that themselves. They enjoy that very much,
Yeah.
making whites afraid of them and so on.
And I think it's important to see that however we understand the psychology of the people involved in these abuses, what we're talking about is finding a political problem.
Sure.
A political problem that begins at the top of American politics, where police are used for the purposes that you describe, Ron. And there is, I think, perfectly reasonable to see the American experience here as unique in the context of capitalist societies around the world. In the last year for which statistics are available, as they say, the police in Germany killed a total of 3 people. In Great Britain, a total of 0 killed by police, and the British police don't have necessarily a reputation of being particularly nice towards the very real racial problems that exist in Great Britain. In Japan, which also has its own racial problems, the police killed no one. Now, if you take those 3 countries together, you're talking about an agglomeration of population about equal to the population of the United States. In the United States, in the same period, police officially are credited with killing 409 people. And many people suggest that's a terrible undercount, that the FBI, which compiles these statistics, ignores an awful lot of police killings. Now, that's an amazing disparity, a disparity that suggests that we're talking about particularly an American political problem. And I think that's quite right. And in some ways, almost the most shocking story of this week is the story of the Police Reform Commission be appointed by President Obama to deal with the events that have caused these demonstrations across the country, with the recent police killings across the country. He's appointed as chairman of this group a chief of police from Philadelphia and Washington who is known to have been involved with particularly abusive police tactics against protesters. Now, this is amazing. I mean, there's a barefacedness to that that's really hard to imagine. And when we have our politicians viewing with alarm the supposedly imperial activities of the presidency in regard to immigration, then something like this comes along and a peculiarly American problem is dealt with reference to an official who has been involved with abuse and repression. And the president gets away with that. I've heard almost no mention of the fact that this guy, Charles Ramsey, police chief in Philadelphia, who's been appointed head of this commission.
Goodness, I hadn't even heard that.
Has this history.
Yeah, I know him from way back.
Well, that's right. But Obama.
I mean, not personally, fortunately.
Yeah, but you know what he's done.
Yeah, exactly.
And Obama can appoint that, and I have not heard any national news make the point who this man Ramsey is, who is the head of the Police Reform Commission, to respond to the demonstrations that are going on across the country.
Yeah, well, there are several problems in trying to think about this and infect our reasoning. One is to try to blame a lot of these misdeeds on human nature. And that can't be right.
Well, it's not squirrel nature. I mean, come on, these are human.
Yeah,
what do you mean by blaming on human nature?
Well,
I mean, this is what people are doing, and we can look for the political reasons for it.
Yeah,
I mean,
there are several different things that might be meant by human nature. There's a kind of maximalist view that human nature is everything that everyone has ever done, and the minimalist view is those things that everyone has in common, which is very little, in fact. And so I don't favor that as an explanation.
It explains either too much or too little.
Yeah, right. As an explanation of anything involving human nature. The other one is essentially demonic possession or something. where
We don't have to go there. I mean, we've got politics and a clear political purpose for these killings. And the political purpose is endemic to the society, and perhaps particularly notable in American society right now. We're not dealing with
well, I mean,
mysteries here.
I mean, I think sometimes we just have to get back to basic Emil Durkheim, 19th century sociology. He wasn't my favorite 19th century sociologist. That would be Karl Marx. But still, what Durkheim argued was, if you have a phenomenon that's relatively common, then you stop attributing it to individual character, individual behavior. You look for the social causes. That's what the origins of modern sociology is supposed to be. And you could talk about social psychology in that framework, but it isn't because of anything unique about Darren Wilson or any of these other people who've been killing black youth, any of these other policemen, or to include George Zimmerman in that group. It isn't anything so unique about them that you would want to that's what the newspapers like. They like to talk about their backgrounds and this business that they did about George Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin coming from different backgrounds and meeting at this point, or Darren Wilson and Michael Brown coming from these backgrounds and having this fateful meeting at this point. That makes for maybe a good story, but it doesn't help us to explain why Darren Wilson behaved that way, or why Michael Brown behaved that way when he was told what he was told. But the bottom line is that Michael Brown didn't deserve to get killed for what he did. In no way can one argue that he was a threat and that Darren Wilson's life was in danger. In all these cases, the person who ends up killed doesn't have any weapons.
Yeah.
But
this has come up again and again in the right-wing and conservative media, is pointing out the respects in which these people have done bad things, and the implicit conclusion, they never are crazy enough to draw it explicitly, is that they deserve to be killed.
Yeah, exactly.
But and on top of this, what these recent events have done also have exposed the nature of grand juries and the way grand juries operate in relation to the police. And that's certainly a systematic level thing. Grand juries operate completely differently for cops than they do for everyone else in the country.
Yeah. Well, this was especially obvious in the case in Ferguson, where the district attorney there cooked up an entirely, apparently unique and unprecedented procedure for doing this. And he kept it out of a court, criminal court, away from the petit jury, when there are certain rules that apply concerning cross-examination and so on that were never carried out in the case of Ferguson.
But the answer to this is not psychology or philosophy. The answer to this is politics. I mean, there are political reasons for the grand jury to operate that way and for this particular prosecutor to operate that way. And it's these questions that have to be addressed. What in fact these cases have done is reveal to a lot of Americans who weren't aware of it, of how the police are being used in this society, and how the direction of that use of police comes from the top down. It comes from our political leaders on down.
Well, are there certain policy or structural reforms that are possible? For example,
yes,
if we have better educated police, now a number of them, amazing number of them are high school dropouts, for example. And if we required them to have 4-year college degrees, would that improve matters?
I have my hesitations about whether that would be the case.
Yes.
When I used to teach sociology, including Durkheim, by the way, at the little university around the corner, I was amazed at the number of people who were taking sociology because they wanted to become police officers.
Yeah.
So it's, maybe Durkheim did some good for them, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole aspect of modern sociology that probably can be traced to Durkheim that has to do with understanding social structure and social forces, but also control.
Exactly.
The issue of control.
Right.
And that's what the field of social psychology, for better or worse, is a lot about that. It's a lot about understanding behavior and how authority or social norms or whatever can control behavior. And there's a lot of assumptions in that we have to question in regard to the larger, the larger context as it would be viewed by that other 19th century sociologist who we more often refer to on this program.
What do you think of what we might call Durkheim's dictum that social facts deserve a phenomenon, deserve a social explanation?
Well,
but
that's,
now
that's
we try to
a
refer it
truism,
all
a
to
good
individual
truism.
psychology.
That's what Noam Chomsky would call the kind of truism that deserves being called a truism.
Exactly.
and should be recognized as such.
Yeah.
And the point is to remember that truisms are, as they say, true.
I'm sorry.
No.
Could I just segue
Sure. Yeah,
into a
right.
couple of comments?
Absolutely.
I just want to put about 3 things on the table here, just very, hopefully briefly, and that is what Glenn Ford at Black Agenda Report is calling the Black Misleadership class.
Yes.
And it would be nice to hear a little more discussion in the, I guess what you would call the mainstream left media, for example, Amy Goodman, about the role of people like Al Sharpton and Michael Eric Dyson.
Michael Eric Dyson.
Who as spokesperson for this Black Misleadership class that Glenn Ford talks about. One aspect of this Black Misleadership class are, Director Jason will be interested to find out, popped up on the TNT NBA basketball pregame show last night when Charles Barkley and
right.
Kenny Smith had a little conversation about some critical comments that Charles Barkley had made of his fellow blacks in regard to recent events, and that Kenny Smith wrote an article upbraiding him as someone who wasn't particularly informed to talk about politics. Not that he doesn't have a right to talk about it, but that he's not particularly informed. So that little outburst will probably get a lot of press in the next few days. It's already begun to get a certain amount of press. I suspect we'll be hearing from our friend Dave Zirin about this, although we haven't yet. But in any event, that is something, there is an effect that the Michael Brown and the whole, what's going on in New York and Ferguson and Cleveland and Oakland and other places, that has really brought this to a level of consciousness that it's bursting out even in sports.
Absolutely.
And with the St. Louis Rams and the few players who made a protest pre-game.
Yeah, there were 4 of them, in fact. And may I say that the now officially nameless Washington football team, players for that team did it first. That is, and in both cases, in Washington and St. Louis, the local watch and ward societies, maybe local police societies, have been vigorous in their demand that the National Football League discipline these players for using the Ferguson gesture, the hands up, don't shoot gesture that the protesters are using.
Now they're saying, I can't breathe.
Right? Yeah,
right.
But this is important coming from these folks, and this is one of the reasons that our political leaders are so worried about it. When sports figures who have the national ear, so to speak, like Charles Barkley and the St. Louis and Washington football players, are talking about these things, and other people are talking about them as well, and this has to be suppressed unless we get some serious criticism of what actually is being done by the police and the military from the top down in this country. They're worried. They are actually worried.
What I wanted to mention in the most general sense is the problem of who gets to use violence and how we judge that. I read recently an essay in a book by the political theorist Corey Robin called The Reactionary Mind, which is the book that he's most famous for, which is a collection of essays. And in one of the later essays, he's talking about the debate about violence in relation to the war on terror and how we have actually different standards. We set a lower standards for state-sponsored violence than we do for violence of those such as, for instance, the Palestinians who are resisting state violence or resisting occupation. And he was obviously, of course, very, very critical of that. But again, we see that reflected in the racially related events in this country. We're talking about, on the one hand, state-sponsored violence, setting a very low bar for the use of that, and then asking demonstrators and protesters to set a very high bar for lifting, for any, for any violence. And of course, they are being well advised not to be violent because they're weak. But the question still becomes, why a double standard? And at what point is it justified for oppressed peoples to, such as I was going to raise the issue of the Black Panthers, I was going to propose that the Washington nameless team become perhaps the Washington Black Panthers. And there's been a lot of talk about the Black Panthers lately on the Real News Network because some long jailed Black Panthers are writing their in the Baltimore area, or speaking out and writing memoirs after having spent too much time in prison, after being obviously jailed unjustly in the first place. So these issues go way back and connect current events to debates that were brought up by the Civil Rights Movement and the Black Power movement in the 1960s.
I'm amazed how much this evening's discussion has paralleled a course I used to teach at the little university around the corner, where the subjects were Marx, Durkheim, and Max Weber. Mm-hmm. It's Max Weber, the 19th century, well, early 20th century German sociologist, who insisted that the proper way of talking about the state was as a monopoly of violence. The human community that successfully claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory. That's the state. It's a political problem from Weber's definition points out that what we're talking about here is fundamentally a political problem, and indeed the very structure of politics in the capitalist world.
Well, that idea goes back as far as the theory of sovereignty, I think, and why it's legitimate for the king to do thing that something else that no one else can do. John Locke's theory of the state. The state has a monopoly on violence, and this raises in my mind questions about the state. But,
indeed, it
that's
does.
Another matter.
And it even raises even more the question about how the state exercises its monopoly. And those are the real issues we're talking about in America today, in both the domestic form, the monopoly of violence that is being exercised by the political structure at home, and also, of course, abroad, where we're killing people at a substantially greater rate.
But if you start raising questions about the theory of sovereignty, this will lead you into a kind of anarchism very quickly.
That's a very good place to be, as Noam Chomsky would say. You know.
Well, Carl, at least I want to compliment you for the letter you sent to the newspaper that hasn't been published yet. Hopefully, will be. That was disseminated on the list, calling for the Champaign police to disarm. And I think that's something that needs to be said. I think I might have even said it before in this program.
Yep,
so
you
maybe
have
I should compliment myself. So you stole that from me, but you know.
Well, if I'm stealing from Durkheim, Marx, and Weber, join the club.
Right. I certainly deserve that accolade, but still, it's like these are the kind of things we have to think about. It's unthinkable. People have to ask themselves, why is it unthinkable? What danger would the cops be in if they weren't armed, or if they kept their arms in their car, or in the police car, or in the trunk, or whatever, and they were there if they needed them, but that the people understood that the cops aren't armed would change the whole dynamic between the police and the citizenry. And I think that's much needed. And any community in this country, including even Champaign, could decide that they'll give that a try. And I think it's worth, various approaches need to be taken. But if you want to look for one practical approach, do that.
I got an interesting objection from a good local liberal, in fact, someone who was involved in your political campaign, to the suggestion about disarming police. And what I have in mind here, of course, is the British model of the disarming police, where local cops on the beach don't carry sidearms. Obviously, the police have weapons, and if they're needed, such as to shoot those people who want to liberate Julian Assange in London, for example, the British police have no lack of guns. It's still the case that, as I pointed out earlier, last year British police killed no one, and the American police killed hundreds. So I think it's an important model to look at. The objection that came was that, well, of course, there is a distinction between British society and American society because there's so many more guns in America than there are in Britain. Therefore, police have to have guns in order to counter the widespread use of guns. Well, there may be a germ of truth in that, but I don't think a lot. I mean, what's at stake there, of course, is the readiness of the police to use guns in this country in the first instance, not to take down shooters that are killing people in a school or something like that.
Yeah,
That's
you constantly hear about this arms race. The criminals have these heavy weapons, and so we have to have more effective weapons, increase our firepower all the time, the stopping power of our guns and so on.
Here's what I wrote to the News Gazette and to the members of the Champaign City Council, David, that you referred to. I said it's the responsibility of our local political authorities to stop the police in their jurisdiction from perpetrating these killings. The Champaign City Council should be particularly aware of their responsibility, given that a disgraced Champaign police chief was himself involved in the shooting death of an unarmed black teenager. The City Council should, 1, restrict the carrying of guns by police according to the successful British model. 2, establish a police review board with teeth, unlike the feckless Urbana model, including the powers of dismissal and initiative. And 3, provide outside investigation and prosecution of police crimes, but not by other police or, specifically to this jurisdiction, their relatives. So there are immediate reforms that should be taken on the local level here. I've been insisting all evening about the extent to which this is a political problem from the top down in America. That's true. But just because it's a political problem from the top down doesn't mean that the place to start is not here at home. It is indeed. It is here in the city of Champaign or in the city of Urbana, where we sit at the moment. Yeah. These things can all be done on the local level, and the move in American policing for more than a generation has been to remove the control of the police from local control, and that, of course, goes back to the very founding of our settler colonial state here in North America, where local control of the police was paramount.
Yeah, well, there are some relatively minor reforms that could be made that stand a chance, I think, of improving matters. One is finding some way to prevent the prosecutors and the police from being so close. They're too buddy-buddy now. There's a lot of cronyism that goes on there, including in a nearby county, I'm told, the prosecutor's husband is a policeman.
Very nearby.
You mean Champaign County?
Yeah, that's right. Exactly.
I don't know why you don't want to say that.
Well,
afraid you get prosecuted, Bob?
Yeah, well, right. You never know,
Ron?
right.
Yeah.
But the other thing, there's a lot of talk about supplying. What's the word for the kind of cameras that lapel? I guess it's lapel cameras.
Body cameras.
Body cameras or lapel cameras that police walk around and everything they do will be recorded. Although apparently in one of these cases there was one that was turned off.
Carefully.
I think in the Eric Garner, was it the Eric Garner case or maybe the one in Cleveland? I forget.
Yeah.
But
unfortunately, there's a lot to choose from.
Yeah. And then you find out, well, who is it that's going to make a lot of money from selling body cams to police departments? Well, that's a company called Taser, which is better known for tasers. And so you get past, and then again, tasers were, have been argued for, presented as a preventative measure that one wouldn't have to use lethal force. So as we look at these, as we try to examine these sort of incremental, sort of behaviorally, sort of behavior mod oriented ways of controlling what police do, as opposed to just taking their guns away, we find the companies that sell the guns, sell the tasers, sell the body cams, getting richer and richer. So you look at the structural nature of how all that works, and of course in the national context of the militarized country and all of the weapons that are being sold or even given. I mean, they're at some point they're being bought, whether it's by the federal government or the local governments. But it seems to me that your approach, Carl, a more structural approach towards, taking the guns away and creating a different context to which to talk about all these other things in ways that might involve not making these supply companies rich.
You have some doubts then of selfies as a political reform program.
Yeah. I mean, I'm all for selfies. I don't do them myself, but I'm not gonna. I understand that sort of generational difference there, apparently.
Yeah, well, what you'll run up against is the devout American belief that the solution to all problems is some technological gimmick.
Sometimes it might be.
Yeah, sometimes it might be.
You're watching News from Neptune. We have a few minutes left here, and we've been talking about the horrible events that we've occupied us all this week, and police killings, and the response across the country, major responses across the country to it, and the demand that our political authorities, in fact, do something about it. But of course, one of the things political authorities are doing is conducting war at an increasing rate abroad and lying about it. Not telling Americans what, in fact, they're doing. And it seems to me that these things are not unconnected. I mean, when you establish a situation in which the monopoly of violence is being exercised in order to produce gains for a small part of the community, for the 1%, and that's being exercised at home and abroad, it's difficult to separate the two, home and abroad. It doesn't stop at the water's edge, coming in either direction. And what the American government has done this week does not establish much confidence about the helpfulness of the political system in dealing with these problems. I refer particularly to the ongoing provocation by the U.S. in Ukraine and against Russia. And our program on Tuesday, Ron spent some time, the Aware on the Air program that airs on UPTV on 10 p.m. Tuesday nights. Ron spent a good deal of time talking about the demonization of the president of Russia, the personalization of these issues. And it is indeed a propaganda ploy that we've not seen quite in this form, I think, since Saddam Hussein. It's a very dangerous phenomenon because the things that the U.S. is doing, that the Obama administration is doing in Eastern Europe, not unconnected with what they're doing in the Mideast and in the Far East, is very dangerous indeed.
Well, there's a briefer version of it dealing with Muammar Gaddafi, but took him down very quickly.
One of the, I'm sorry, say that again, Ron?
Yeah. It took down Muammar Gaddafi very quickly after the demonization campaign.
Oh, and the usefulness of that, yes, exactly.
Well, it was 30 years before they took him down, but still.
Well, he was playing ball. He tried to play ball in the meantime, and that was turned, he did not follow the instruction of bringing a long spoon when you supped with the devil, and the result was that he was soup, right?
Carl, I was particularly interested in your reference to the faking left going right business in relation to Chuck Hagel. I mean, here we have an ironic irony where we were supposed to support a Republican, a an allegedly Republican realist, and genuinely probably was in that category, not a category I support or subscribe to,
Right.
but at least something that distinguished Hegel from the neocons, and from the neocons to his alleged right, and from the neocons to his left, which is what the Obama administration is really about. It's a kind of a liberal neoconservatism in terms of foreign policy. So they had to get rid of the more diplomatic defense secretary and get a real militaristic, boots on the ground defense secretary.
Obama ran defense secretary. Yes.
So you go back to the Republican didn't work. I mean, it was really faking left with a Republican and then going right with the Democratic sort of Hillary Clinton, to invoke another name in all this. This is what we have to look forward to, probably beginning in 2017.
Now Hillary is in deep trouble with the right by suggesting that we should try to have a certain amount of sympathy or compassion toward our enemies and so on. And some right-wingers now are yelling that this removes her from consideration.
That sounds like that is just campaign rhetoric.
Yeah, that's right.
Pre-campaign rhetoric.
And there's a story here that I think really does need to be demystified. The story is that there are those nasty neocons out there who want war and who forced us into war in Iraq in the Bush administration. And thank goodness they all went away when the Bush administration went away. And Barack Obama, who used the anti-war movement to become president, of course, has been defending us against those neocons. What looks like being dangerous in Washington right now is the neocons are redivivis. They're reviving. They're coming back. This is. At the very best, this is good cop, bad cop mythology. Yeah. This is the other side of the question. This is domestic politics being transformed into foreign policy. The neocons never went away. If by neocons you mean those people who were promoting war abroad in order to defend the profits of the American 1%. That's what the Middle East war was all about. And Barack Obama is an even more active proponent of the war that George Bush and continued. He didn't set it off. George Bush continued in his administration. The idea that there's been any change, any alteration in American policy on anything more than the tactical level, what do we do now, is nonsense. The American strategy, the American policy remains the same, and Obama has been particularly vicious in putting it into practice. 5,000 dead people from his drone attacks alone, which were designed precisely to mislead Americans about the war that he was carrying on. The drone campaign is secret. We don't admit we're doing it, except when we want to admit we want to boast in a back channel way that Obama is at least as vigorous in killing terrorists as his predecessors. The idea that there has been an alteration in American policy at any point, except in the sense of making it more hidden and probably more vicious, is simply false.
Okay, has there been any variation in the prominence of people like Robert Kagan?
In the prominence of these people?
Yeah.
You can change the personnel if you want. The short answer is no. I mean, in the sense that Obama himself has recommended Kagan's book, and his wife, Kagan's wife, as you point out, Ron, was instrumental in the employment of fascists to overthrow an elected government in Ukraine in order to get at the Eurasian economy.
Of their prominence in the public media and consciousness.
But this is more a matter of career politics, career courses. It's like the old neocons are in and the new neocons are out. they have to keep sort of changing up to make us think that there's going to be a change in policy, but there really isn't a change in policy. I mean, I referred to a chapter in Corey Robin's book about the double standard and the use of violence, and one of the books that this critique was based on was a book by Michael Walzer, the social democratic editor of Dissent, the quarterly journal Dissent, and again, Corey Robin just takes Michael Walzer's, supposedly liberally minded opinions of war apart because they're the same thing. That's the idea of the fancier words for saying that the state has a right to impose violence. And Walzer goes on about this business about the last resort, and it's not really the last resort. We can't hold the state to the standard of using violence as a last resort, because there's always more and more and more you can do. If you hold them to that standard, they'd never be able to have any violence. So this is what Michael Walzer is saying, So I mean, it just gets all mushed together in terms of the people who want a little war or a little more war.
Right. Well, that would be my position. There is no last resort. There's always something more you can do.
Well, Michael Walzer doesn't like you then.
I don't care.
I should declare an interest here. Some of the first political campaigns I was ever involved in was Gene McCarthy's run for president in New England, and the organizer of our group was a young political scientist named Michael Walzer, and there he was. He was a liberal after all. Working for, and has gone on to write about the just war theory, which, by the way, as a theory, I think is quite sound, and write about the just war theory, but pointing out that the only just wars that he knows of are all the wars started by Israel. So it
just works out that way.
It just works out that way.
We have to get back to the biblical interpretation of things to really understand.
Moses is a founding father, as you pointed out.
It should be in our textbooks. Our children should be learning that the only just wars ever fought were the ones Israel has fought with its neighbors.
Circling back around to the textbook point that you mentioned at the beginning of the hour, Ron, I think this is a great thing. I think for these textbooks to be out there, that means that someone has to talk about it. Or normally this sort of talk goes on and no one ever mentions it. And this is the sort of thing students get. I'm happy to have it on the front page. That's very worthwhile.
Yeah, but there's this element in American society that we need to control what people are taught. And you may recall that the president of Purdue University attacked Howard Zinn's books and so on. And
but don't let your children grow up to read textbooks.
That's why Zinn is so important.
Who are the books that are not teaching Americanism. I've heard people get up and go on and on at length about this. What the schools should be teaching is Americanism.
They're not our problem.
Whatever that is.
They're not our problem. In fact, when they bring that up, then we can talk about it. You've been watching News from Neptune for the 49th week of 2014, a Watch What We Do, Not What We Say edition. I'm Carl Estabrook. Now, discussers tonight have been Ron Zook and David Green. Our thanks to our director and producer, Jason Liggett. Upcoming programs here on UPTV include Labor's Worldview, Sunday at 4 p.m. with Neptuner David Johnson, and news and comment that you can't hear elsewhere in CU, including Bill Press and Stephanie Miller, weekday mornings, and France 24 late at night. More news from outside the bubble, as Harry Shearer says, coming soon. And on WRFU Radio, listen to Living Simply, first Fridays at 8 a.m. with Neptuner. So,
I did it this morning.
There's a note, and is that archived anywhere? I mean, people, you've got to start doing that, I think. A new column.
Die in on the quad tomorrow at noon if you're interested in that kind of thing.
Excellent. Good point. New column and Smile Politely, if I ever get it written. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune. To remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.